So without further ado, I turn it over to Nicole.
Okay. Is my mic on? Is it on now? Yes. All right. Well, one of my early mentors in ministry was both a priest and a farmer. This meant we'd often discuss points of the faith while we were harvesting beans or feeding the pigs. And it also meant that he would bring parts of that world of soil and labor and seeds, into the church. He'd bring it in as sermon illustrations or as imagery in his prayers, and he'd literally bring it in on his boots. He showed me that priesthood can include all of the usual stuff of church and can include something completely different. By yoking two very different vocations, he showed me that a priest can exercise his or her Christian call in an infinite variety of ways. Fast forward a few years, when I moved to Nova Scotia and started discerning my own call to priesthood, I became aware that a number of the Anglican priests here work part-time as parish priests and part-time in some other job. So could it be that these people were finding that kind of balance and cross-pollination that I'd admired in my early mentor? Were these people examples of the bivocational minister that's starting to appear in some literature around church development? Why did they minister this way? And were they carving a path that others could follow, perhaps that I could follow? These were the early questions that blossomed into this graduate research project. I set out to meet people who are serving part-time as parish priests while also working in secular employment. Now, to be clear, there are a number of non-stipendiary priests in the Anglican Diocese of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. Those aren't the people I interviewed. Non-stipendiary priests are designated to minister in a single congregation, and they serve alongside another priest. As the name indicates, they're not eligible for stipended or salaried jobs in the church. I was interested to meet stipendiary clergy serving as part-time rectors. A rector or an incumbent is a clergy person with charge over a parish. I discovered that of the 103 parishes in the Anglican Diocese of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, 19 employ an incumbent on a part-time basis. Some of these part-time priests are also receiving an old age pension or for whatever reason don't require a full-time income. But again, I was interested in those priests who are working two jobs. My suspicion was that these people are further out on a new model of priesthood in the Anglican Church. My suspicion was that they would give a clearer picture of the effect of part-time appointments on the life of a parish. After all, with another job to go to, they were less likely to be working as full-time priests on a half-time stipend. And my suspicion was that as someone approaching ordination in the Anglican Church, I could learn some lessons from these mid-career priests. The trend seems to be towards more part-time appointments in the church, and I won't be eligible for a pension anytime soon. I interviewed 4 priests, 2 men and 2 women, serving in 2 rural and 2 urban parishes in the diocese. They selected these code names for themselves. They're names from the New Testament, and my participants had a taste for the unusual. Each of these priests holds a half or a three-quarter time position as a rector. Well, one of my participants is not paid for her work outside of her parish job. All 4 have substantial commitments outside of parish priesthood. Their work outside the church is in a variety of fields, most often because they're continuing in a career that they had before they discerned a call to priesthood. All of them serve in parishes that at one time, and sometimes as recently as 2 years ago, employed a priest full-time. Every one of my participants identified finances as the single reason their parishes have gone to a part-time clergy appointment. Now, this is important. Some of my participants suggested that their parish's inability to pay a priest full-time was a matter of mindset rather than a concrete reality. All of them identified stewardship as an area in which their congregations are flagging. So in one example, a participant described a 2-point parish with an average Sunday attendance of anywhere between 65 and 95 worshipers, and that parish employs a priest half-time. Across the board, my participants identified past traumas and troubles that have affected financial giving in the parishes. Sometimes this was a matter of key donors dying, or sometimes it was a matter of scandal or poor leadership that destroyed people's confidence in giving to the church. We heard about that in the last presentation. One participant described how her parish was when she arrived there as a half-time priest. They were beleaguered. They were actually more than beleaguered. And again, the decision to go with half-time or part-time ministry was solely because of the financial situation. They hadn't paid the allotment, their share of the diocesan budget, in about a year and a half. They could barely pay their local bills. The doors were ready to close. Now, this is huge. In my research, I'm interested to see whether a new model for priesthood might be emerging from the practice of bivocational ministry, but we have to hear these stories in the context of the deep challenges that are pushing the trend towards part-time appointments in the church. I used a phenomenological method of inquiry to get at the experience of living and working as a bivocational priest. The questions I asked were designed to access participants' sense of vocation both within and beyond their parish priesthood. The questions were designed to expose the realities of pastoring to a congregation within the limits of a part-time appointment while also balancing another job. In my research question, I set a larger frame around those questions of vocation and balance. I asked, what does the experience of bivocational priests tell us about the mission of the church? Now, to be clear, it's not that the church has a mission, but that God has a mission. And it's in responding to that mission that we become the church. This is reflected in the mission statement of this diocese, which says we're here to participate in God's mission of reconciling the world to God through Jesus Christ. To make an analogy, people joined in mission in the church are like people who've noticed the power of a strong wind and gather together to figure out how they can ride that wind. They do their part, and the wind blows where it will. So asking about the mission of the church means asking what God is up to, and asking how we can harness our efforts to God's energy. In talking with these 4 ministers about their lives and work, I was struck again and again by how their personal stories both reflected and influenced the communal life of the parishes they serve. I would suggest that the personal experience of navigating this as yet unusual way of ministering gives bivocational priests a unique perspective on our ecclesiology, on who we are and what we're facing as parishes and as a diocese. 3 major themes emerged from my interviews. I've called these themes looking over the horizon, living with vulnerability, and finding a new place in the community. These themes coincide with the threefold call of the ordained to be prophet, pastor, and priest. On the theme of looking over the horizon, let me introduce Thaddeus. Like other of my participants, looking towards the future of the church stirred feelings of anger for Thaddeus. In the upcoming quote, he begins by describing his own congregation, then sets that in the context of a wider church phenomena. He says, "The people who are coming here are still mostly in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, God only knows where we're going to be. The thing that makes me mad is that the church has known this or could have predicted this for the last 30 years. People stopped coming to church in the late 60s, early 70s. There's one generation still coming to church for the most part, but nobody was wanting to admit that because the money was still coming in. But now, all of a sudden, they're trying to figure out what's going on." As he says, the uncertainty on the horizon is something we've been able to see for a while. But what's inspiring is what he's done in response to seeing that reality. He's aware that his own future is entwined with what's over the horizon for the whole church. So from the outset, Thaddeus has paired his exercise of priesthood with a career in the trades. He refers to this dual-track career as an experiment, but one worth pursuing. Looking at his future in the church, he asks, what am I buying into, right? That's one of the reasons I'm strategically thinking. I don't want to get screwed in 10 years. I don't want to be up the creek without a paddle, you know? So that was one of the reasons I did it. Yeah, it's an experiment, but it's an experiment because I think we've got to start doing something, and I don't know what that is. It may not be this model, but we've got to start figuring out what we're going to do. Figuring out what we're going to do has to involve the whole parish. A second participant, Elizabeth, talked about a visioning process she has headed up in her current parish. She said, I want to move forward in a vision that is financially viable for this church and is also still a mission. Otherwise, you're not a parish. If you're just trying to hang on and be in palliative care for your old churches, that's not what we're called to, right? The prospect of palliation, of easing towards a comfortable death, is very real in parishes that have scaled back to a part-time ministry position. What I found in my interviews was a refusal of that prospect. These 4 priests have a tenacity and an energy for the ministry of the whole church that I believe is connected to planning a personal future that will be vibrant in the long term. For them, fading away is not an option, but creative rethinking is. There's a prophetic edge to what these folks are saying and doing in the church. They're saying it's time to face our realities and to do something worthy of Christ's commission to teach and baptize in his name. In this, they echo the sentiments of theologian and educator Dale Meyer when he writes, our Lord's great commission is so commanding that we dare not disobey his order by offering the lame excuse that we can't fund churches and institutions. These bivocational priests refuse the excuses and instead step into risky and largely untested ways of being spiritual leaders in their communities. Well, risk and newness leads into the second theme that emerged from my interviews, living with vulnerability. Now, when I set out to interview bivocational priests, I had hoped to meet people who have found a new way of being disciples, both inside and outside the church. But if I'm honest, I had also hoped to find in their stories a stable way of life and some kind of solution for the cash-strapped parishes they serve. I did find discipleship. I didn't find stability. About holding 2 jobs, Bartholomew told me, there's always a tension. When you're there, there's something here you're thinking about. When you're here, there's something there you're thinking about. So it's always a divided loyalty in a sense. Participants used words like pulled, exhausted, and divided when they described the reality of balancing 2 jobs. And as in the secular world, working part-time in the church necessarily exposes these employees to a level of vulnerability. Elizabeth said, every year, our head of finances brings up the fact that we're saving $8,000 to $10,000 by not paying our priest her full-time benefits. And everybody goes, all right. And I go, well, this is not going to work well when I'm an old lady. The reason why parishes are going to part-time employment, namely cost saving, is being borrowed from the secular world. What is not being considered are the expectations around part-time employment in the church. Trefania sums it up. To make that decision in a congregation for financial reasons, to say, this parish can't afford somebody, so we'll give them somebody half-time, you put that person in an untenable situation unless there's some support from outside to say, well, these are the diocese expectations of what it means to be half-time. There are no expectations. It's more like, how many hours? All of my participants talked about this absence of external expectations or models. And as for keeping part-time hours, all my participants said it's impossible to keep regular hours in ministry. Church seasons, pastoral emergencies, and a diocesan culture that assumes full-time availability, none of these fit within the boundaries of a part-time appointment. So my participants continue to rearrange the pieces of their lives. Elizabeth, reflecting on her own life in light of discussions in her parish to scale back her already three-quarter-time position, said this: I was thinking, oh boy, I'd better start thinking about plan B, because I can't afford to keep the house and work here and work another job and never get days off. This is going to kill me eventually. Thank God I'm young and healthy, but when I'm 60, this might not be a very good picture. As they work out what it means to have a dual career lifestyle, these leaders are asking what their ministry is about and how they can best practice it. Now, at the same time, their congregations are undergoing a shift in identity. What does it mean to move from having a full-time priest to having a part-time priest? Is this a viable model for the future, or is it a step on the way to something else? Elizabeth said, we're having a complete shift in the parish. People have to believe there's something hopeful here, which I believe there is right now, in order to step up to the plate and be on parish council. But right at the moment, it could go either way. Now, where both priest and parish are engaged in identity questions, a terrific synergy is possible. Elizabeth put her finger on it when she said, I think I've been very fortunate to come to a place that, whether they want to be or not, they're in a transition. There's an upside to vulnerability. It forces people to pay attention and to make the continual small adjustments necessary to keep on balance and keep safe. Attention, watchfulness, and responsiveness, these are the qualities of the pastor as shepherd, as one who's in the wilderness with the flock. Actually living there requires courage. And this was the pastoral quality I found at the heart of my participants' ministries. My final theme, finding a new place in the community, is I think the most hopeful of the three. In these interviews, I discovered that priests who spend a good deal of their time outside of the church are likely to be carrying on ministry in unlikely places. Bartholomew said, for a few years, they would have been better off to hire me as a chaplain at my secular workplace. My door was like a revolving door. People would stop by and say, do you have a minute? And I'd think, really? A minute? And even now, I have people who have nothing to do with the church, nothing to do with any church, call me and say, hey, can you come over? I've got something I need to talk to you about. Thaddeus has discovered another language through his secular work, a language that reaches beyond the usual church-going crowd. He said of his work in the trades, it's an entrance into conversation with people. I found a certain amount of ease, particularly with some of the men of the parish. There's something they can talk to me about, even if they're not going to want to talk to me about the other side. Even if spirituality doesn't come up in these encounters, people know Thaddeus is a priest. That's part of what they're absorbing and encountering in his presence. He said, when people find out that I do what I do, that changes their preconceptions of what ministry is. This was a common story in my interviews. The ministry of presence was very strong for my participants. Every one of them spoke of how they'd been drawn to the community, and I mean the wider, the social and geographic community in which they now minister. Bartholomew said, I really like the idea of being in a place where the church can live out its social justice calling and its involvement with the wider community, where the walls need to be very transparent. Now, of course, this passion for the wider community sometimes creates its own tensions. Tryphania told me, my sense of vocation as a priest, it's not only to the people that are inside, who come to church, which I sometimes feel guilty about. You can get busy with outside things. Not that they're ever really outside, but the people who come faithfully and support the church faithfully sometimes get lower down on the list of priorities in terms of my time. This rootedness in community is what sets today's bivocational priests apart from the Apostle Paul, whom many consider to be the original bivocational minister. Paul was a tent maker, and as he makes clear in 1 Corinthians 8, his secular work allowed him to offer the gospel free of charge and, by extension, free of ulterior motives. His ministry, but significantly, Paul was not a presbyter. His ministry was distinct from that of settled local elders or clergy. He was a missionary, a church planter. He was a traveling preacher, but he was not a priest making his home in the community. While it's tempting to uphold Paul's tent-making ministry as the model for today's part-time priests, we cannot applaud one aspect of the apostles' ministry, that of being self-supporting, without recognizing the basic form of his ministry, that of an itinerant. I got the sense from my participants that today's call to mission is not a call to go way out there, but to go into the neighborhoods where we're already rooted. Bartholomew said, "There's a huge hunger for spiritual connection, for purpose, for relationship, both human relationship and human-divine relationship, however you conceive of that. And we have the wherewithal to fulfill that need, but we're not offering it in a way that people can hear. On the whole, the traditional structures and ministries of the church are not reaching the people right outside our churches. But as my participants' stories of finding a new place in the community indicate, people want to connect with people of faith. The call to engagement beyond where we've been as church communities is the clarion call of bivocational priests serving today. We're being invited to live out of a new center, not inside our church buildings, not even necessarily inside our current church communities, but in our neighborhoods and villages. As the trend towards more part-time ministry appointments continues, and I believe it will, the challenge for us is to move into this reality with minds and hearts open to see possibility and not diminishment. This present research points towards some implications and recommendations in this regard. First off, I'm happy to report that in the course of this project, I've been consulting with Diocesan Bishop Sue Moxley, and partly in response to our conversations, she's called together a selection of part-time clergy to discuss two questions. What does it take for part-time work to be healthy parish leadership, and what are the pitfalls? In this diocese, there's never been a gathering of clergy working in a part-time capacity, so this upcoming meeting is part of the essential work of setting out some expectations around this way of ministering. Second, there needs to be consultation with the lay people who've gone through the transition from having full-time to part-time clergy leadership in their parishes. I'm very aware that the stories and insights that I've gathered represent at best half the picture. The hopeful literature around bivocational ministry assumes robust participation of the lay people in the ministries of the church. Well, is this the reality in the parishes that currently employ a clergy leader part-time? If not, what more is needed? We need to find out, not only for the sake of those parishes, but for the sake of the many parishes that are considering whether to go part-time. Third, we need to hear the stories of ministry in unusual places. We need to hear those stories of the revolving office door and the shop talk sessions with the community priest. By including these, our diocesan and national publications could help us be less inward-looking and more delighted with the God-given opportunities to connect our ministries to our world. Fourth, we need to hear the stories of congregations and dioceses in transition so that we can hear the possibilities around bivocational priesthood in a larger context. My participants told me their parishes will have to consider significantly changing their sense of identity if they're to continue in ministry into the future. We need to hear the stories of churches that have been transformed in their sense of identity to assure us that God is in our present changes and chances for growth. In this research, I was privileged to meet 4 ministers with a fullness of heart and a passion for God's mission. I'd like to close with some words from one of my participants. Her courage and trust and openness to God have been an inspiration to me. Tryphania said, "There's just all kinds of possibilities. The problem is, there's Chronos and Kairos, you know? We might get there eventually, it just might not be on our timetable. And even if we don't get there, wherever we get will be infinitely more than we can ask for or imagine." That's also been the story of my life. That just because I have all these great ideas, I'm not always right. I mean, this isn't where I intended to be, and yet I'm glad I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
You know, I think about, the idea of the artist priest or the carpenter priest or the farmer priest, and what good that might, what they do in one world feeds into the church, and I think how nice that is. But I think about maybe the car mechanic who fixes your car on Thursday and then preaches to you on Sunday, and I wonder a little bit about that. But so, questions for?
There's one from John.
And just for myself. There we go. Nicole, I'm wondering, kind of following along Susan, is it because, do you think we've put calling into a box? And in the United Church, for example, we're called to word, sacrament, and pastoral care. Mm-hmm. But what about word, sacrament, and farming? Or, we put calling in a box. And so rather than seeing bivocational as kind of a failing of a church to pay full wages to a priest, that we actually understand calling in a different way. And I'm wondering if you get that sense.
Yeah. I think that's a great comment, John. Thank you. Calling is, I began by saying that we can exercise our Christian call in an infinite variety of ways, and I do believe that, and I think there's lots of opportunity to give more exciting definitions for what is call. It sometimes gets talked about like it's something easy, like you're called to be the church usher or you're called to fold the bulletins. I mean, if that's as good as it gets, well, that's not the infinite variety of Christian call that I'm talking about. That sense that your life can be absolutely united with the life of God. Like that's my aim. That's where it gets exciting for me. Yeah.
Nicole, did you have any sense of what the congregations thought of bivocational? I only say that because I've actually done a little bit of what you're talking about. The congregation tends to support you, the church doesn't, was my experience, and I just wondered if you could comment on what the congregations thought.
Okay. Certainly, as I said just in some of my closing comments there, this study I wasn't able to have those in-depth conversations with people in the congregations. I'd love to. In terms of acceptance of the bivocational piece, my guess would be that in the abstract, there's tremendous support for that. And it's not that there's a back up. There's lots of overlap between bivocational ministry amongst those who have a part-time clergy appointment and those who just have a full life, right? So when we talk about call, and that comes back to what you were saying, John, that living out call may be living as a parent or as a child of aging parents or whatever. All of those things that working priests may have as part of their balance. And it's the feeling in congregations of having some access to that fullness of the priest's life is pretty exciting. So, of course, there are boundaries. And some of my participants talked about that in fact it was nice for them to be able to step into something completely different. One of them said, sometimes I've used my other job as a way to get away from priesthood. Now, that's on one end of the scale, but on the other is this sense of, no, this is someone who has a full life, who in going out and doing the other things that he or she does, is gathering spiritual riches that then feed back into the community. And so that is where it gets very exciting for the congregations. Yeah.
Is it over here?
As a first career minister, I don't really have a whole lot of other skills. So, and as a rural minister, I don't really have a whole lot of options. You know, I can work at the McDonald's in town. When you say bivocational, what are you saying that sort of thing inclusive? Like, what's the future look like for first career ministers like myself, who might be looking at a future where there's probably more part-time than full-time?
Ricky, I wish I knew. I'm not that many years older. Yeah. Though you do bring up an interesting point as well. Because it's a particular dream of mine that this could be possible, you know, this rounded bivocational life, I decided to go with that for this research project. But I have to admit that in some of my interviews, it was very plain to me that bivocational was a bit lofty in terms of trying to describe, which is why I sometimes spoke of it as a dual career lifestyle. The sense of calling to work at the other job is something perhaps that was there more strongly early in life, and as people have transitioned into priesthood, it's like that's been convenient, has been financially convenient to have that other avenue of support. But the sense of calling changes, and I certainly heard from some of my participants that more and more they wanted to be immersed in the parish priesthood, and sometimes the limiting factor was, but the parish can't afford that. So there's certainly that aspect, and it's true for those. There are implications here for the training of people who are going into ministry. I've been just waiting for a time to bring in this image. I was thinking about this is a bit of a riddle, and I think I finally have an answer to it. But if you take a piece of cake and you cut it in half, what you have left, you know, wherever that other half goes, you still have a piece of cake left, right? I mean, it's essentially the same thing. So what is something that if you cut it in half, you no longer have the same thing? Imagine a bicycle, right? Imagine you cut a bicycle in half and say, now you get to ride a unicycle. Well, that takes a whole other set of skills. So for people who have got half-time appointment in a church, it's not that you can do everything. You certainly can't. So the skills need to be there to say, I need to know how to let go of stuff and draw boundaries and say no over and over again, at the same time as empowering the people to do what needs to be done here for the sake of God's mission. And yeah, there's my preaching on that one.
Amen, sister. I'm going to get David and then I'll come back to you.
Nicole, just with reference to your response to John's question and your infinite number of ways, there's undoubtedly an infinite number of ways in which one can respond to a call to be in relationship with God and to be conformed to Christ. But the formula that John said was existent in the United Church is a very particular understanding of Christ's tripartite ministry as prophet, priest, and king. And it's predicated upon an understanding that the participation in Christ's prophetic ministry, preaching and stuff like that, is a particular kind of thing. Which is not to say you can't be a Christian as a mixed martial artist or running a casino, I'm sure you can.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the church calls people to do particular Christy kind of things, which challenges that infinite stuff, because Christ does certain things and Christ doesn't do everything. And so I just want to, because your answer seemed to imply a muddying of the word by, because the word by seems to imply quite properly one's vocation in a whole host of areas, and one's vocation to a particular form of ministry, which looks like this. It looks like Christ.
Right. Right.
And I just wonder if you want to sort of just unpack that a little. For those like me who are very particular, the priesthood involves prophet, priest, certain forms of servitude, looks like this. Because you're doing a great job broadening my categories, and yet at the same time I'm very uncomfortable with the language of infinite, because the ministry is a particular form of thing. The privilege is preaching over mixed martial artistry, which is not to say that's not fine too.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
True enough. And I'm recalled to other discussions that we've had about do we ordain people in order to create professional Christians? And are we not all called to live out of a baptismal covenant? Well, that's absolutely true. Are some also called to live out the priesthood? Yeah, that is true. And I wouldn't want to ultimately conflate those, because there are particular charisms. And it came up certainly in an interview with one of my participants who had a background outside of the Anglican Church. His notions of ministry were from his early life were quite different, were quite broad, and there were things that he'd experienced in the Anglican Church as blessings, but certainly as different. Things like even the clothes we wear. I mean, there are a few of those collars on display here today. That identity as sometimes referred to as a sacrament in the community, the sacrament of priesthood, and the ways that we have of identifying that. So absolutely, those need to be valued, and to get back to training and education, and somewhat to touch on the phenomena of non-stipendiary priests in the Anglican Church. There's a setting aside of the non-stipendiary priests that is genuine, but it's not as definite perhaps as it is for people who've gone through all of the education and formation and molding and that degree of setting aside. And I think that is something that needs to be preserved. It's a gift of the Anglican Church that in fact it's not just whoever's present can open the Bible and lead on. So simply to affirm really what you've said, David. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. It was a great presentation. I can think of a whole myriad of questions. I met a Roman Catholic priest once who told me that he was semi-retired, and he said that's kind of like being semi-pregnant. I don't know of a full-time minister who can fit enough hours into the week. So I have grave concerns about how anybody can be expected to function as a minister in a part-time capacity, because I don't know how they do that. People don't die on Monday and Tuesday every week. And there's going to be crisis ministry that has to be done in the interim. It boggles my mind how anybody could pull that off. And it's been my experience so far with the United Church, anyhow, when you start to look at positions with a reduction of ministerial staff, that the first thing that seems to be falling off the cart is pastoral care. It seems to me that seems to be something that people seem to think they can just download to the congregation. And I'm not sure how that works. And I mean, I know it's not within the scope of your particular project, but I was wondering if you found any of that, you know, what those people were saying. They had to give up in terms of their ministry to do a part-time ministry.
Okay. Yeah, in my interviews, I did ask people questions of how do you calculate the time that you spend, and then how do you fill that time? How do you fill your parish priest hours in a week or a month or a year, or however that's divided, however that's calculated for you? And the things that came out very, very strongly, certainly the liturgical piece, which would include preaching, certainly as well the pastoral piece. That was very important in the congregations, that there be a sense of access. So participants had different ways of negotiating that, knowing full well, I can't do a funeral on Tuesday, I'm at my other job. That's well and good. So in some places there would be a lay pastoral team that would be doing some of the basic stuff, the care of community, and then would refer back to the priest. This person really needs to see you, and so if there was good communication there, that could be shared somewhat. But the pastoral piece was very important as part of the package that people wanted from the priest. The other pieces that people identified as important were the teaching pieces. Again, that could certainly come up in preaching, but also being part of the Bible studies and whatnot. And really, participants talked about focusing the questions on what are we doing and why are we doing it, and why are we doing it here? So really unearthing some of that sense of what's the deep identity of this Christian community in this particular location, so that people could continue to claim that as their reason for being a Christ-centered community in that place, and so that it wouldn't all fall on the priest to be the Christian identity either. Yeah.
The church still has to be the church. Right? I missed you a while ago, and I'll come over that side.
Thank you.
Whoops.
Nicole, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I do have a question, though. You had mentioned earlier that there were 19 out of 103 parishes that had gone bivocational. Now, of the balance, I'm just wondering, did you get any feedback on saying, hey, I'm not working 2 jobs, but I'm now working 3 parishes where I used to have 1?
Interestingly, one of the ways that came up, because it's a particular choice for a parish to say, we'd like to stay as we are, we'd like to be in a sense, a standalone parish. We can't afford a full-time priest. We'll pay someone half-time or 3/4 time. That is, in a sense, instead of saying, well, let's look at an amalgamation with another parish or a reconfiguration of identity in that way. And one of my participants made the comment that he was guessing that from his parishioners' point of view, that wouldn't be as good a situation. Being 1 point amongst 7, even if you have a full-time priest, what are the chances that you're going to see that person very much? So there is, I'm not sure if it's a sense of reality or a sense of resistance to looking at some of those other options. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's just take one more, and then again, you will have an opportunity to meet and greet our presenters tomorrow.
Nicole, can you blue sky just for a minute? I'm going to let you blue sky.
All right. Yeah.
So it seems to me that a lot of the churches are moving from the model where you know where you are, and you have a plan to move to where you want to go. So a defined situation A to a defined situation B with a plan. That was the old model. The new model is we don't really know where we are, so it's undefined situation
Right.
A. We don't really know where we're going to go, but we have to go somewhere. So it's undefined situation B, and we're not sure about the plan either. So talk to me a little bit about how the notion of folks who are bivocational, in the way that you've outlined it here, might fit into that overall transformative process. It wasn't meant to be hard.
It's a beautiful question. It really is. Well, some of the things that excite me are that inevitably people are up to interesting stuff in their lives. And as some of those examples of, particularly of finding a new place in the community, and some of the ones I had to cut from the presentation, really showed me that, I mean, all things aside, there are people who just want to get on with stuff and who are getting on with stuff, whether it's programs or it's pastoral relationships or whatever, and they don't want to be alone in that necessarily. So, you know, I don't think it needs to be necessarily a kind of a follow the charismatic leader, and yet I think there's a possibility for, I want to do what that person's doing. I wonder if I can join that person in that thing that she's got going on over there at the hospital or at the park or wherever. And then just expanding those. It's kind of like the notion of having house churches, except you're not at home, you know? Church is going to be out in the park. It's going to be wherever it's going to be. And that starts just building its own momentum. That sense of, we're in this community. We don't need to be in this building, but we need to be in this community. And I know that because I love it here. And gathering into those kind of cells that would cross parish boundaries as well. And why not, particularly in a place where there's a parish every few blocks, or as one participant described, in a town where there are 7 churches. The sense of not carving out a territory that this is ours, but rather, here's a spot where we're just going to alight for a time for this, and then we'll see what happens afterwards. It may not be in continuity with this at all. Yeah.
Well done. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.